When Michael Jordan walked through airport security that Thursday afternoon, he thought it would be just another routine checkpoint. He had flown thousands of times before, passed through hundreds of metal detectors, never had a problem. But when the security officer looked at the scanner showing what was inside his bag, her face went completely pale. She pressed a button on her radio, and within seconds, 2 more officers rushed over. They pulled Michael aside and everyone in line started staring and taking out their phones. Michael felt his heart pounding because he knew exactly what was in his bag, and none of it should have caused this kind of reaction. What the scanner revealed that day would make these 3 security officers cry, would force Michael to tell a secret he had kept hidden for 23 years, and would show the world that even the greatest champions carry something with them that has nothing to do with trophies or fame. The fluorescent lights of O'Hare International Airport buzzed overhead as Michael Jordan stood in line at Terminal 3, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and his shoulders hunched in that familiar way celebrities adopt when they desperately want to blend into the crowd. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, and the security checkpoint hummed with the usual chaos of travelers shuffling forward, removing shoes, emptying pockets, and preparing their belongings for the conveyor belt that would carry them through the scanner's unforgiving gaze. Michael had done this routine 1,000 times before, maybe more, in airports across every continent. But today, something felt different. Something he couldn't quite name settled like a stone in his chest as he moved closer to the checkpoint. The security officer manning the metal detector was a woman named Patricia Henshaw, 53 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen too many early mornings and too many late nights. She had worked at O'Hare for 27 years, long enough to have screened everyone from presidents to pop stars, and she prided herself on treating every passenger with the same professional courtesy regardless of who they were or what they had accomplished. When Michael stepped up to her station, placing his carry-on bag on the belt and his phone in the plastic bin, Patricia glanced at him with the same neutral expression she gave everyone else, though something flickered in her eyes that suggested recognition, even if she chose not to acknowledge it. Michael walked through the metal detector without incident, the device remaining silent as he passed through its invisible field. But when Patricia glanced at the monitor displaying the X-ray image of his bag, her hand froze over the button that would have sent it along its way. She stared at the screen, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. And then she looked up at Michael with an expression that had shifted from neutral professionalism to something harder, something that made his stomach drop, even though he had no idea what she had seen. She pressed a button and spoke into her radio with a voice that carried just enough edge to make every passenger within earshot turn their heads and stare. 2 more security officers appeared within seconds, a younger man named Derek Santos, whose badge identified him as a supervisor, and an older woman named Cheryl Voss, who moved with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of dealing with difficult situations. Derek approached Michael with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes and asked him to step aside. Please, just routine, nothing to worry about. But the way Cheryl was already pulling his bag off the belt and setting it on a stainless steel table told a different story. Michael felt heat rising in his face. Not anger exactly, but something closer to humiliation mixed with confusion, because he knew exactly what was in his bag, and none of it should have caused this kind of reaction. Patricia joined Derek and Cheryl at the inspection table, and the 3 of them huddled together, speaking in voices too low for Michael to hear, while passengers streamed past, some stealing glances at the scene unfolding, some pulling out their phones to record what they hoped might become viral content. Michael stood there with his hands at his sides, fighting the urge to demand answers, to ask what the hell was going on, to remind them who he was and how many times he had flown without incident, but something told him that playing that card would only make things worse. He had learned over the years that celebrity could be a shield or a target depending on the situation, and right now, he couldn't tell which way this was going to break. Derek finally looked up from the table and gestured for Michael to come closer, and as he approached, he could see his bag sitting open, its contents partially visible, but nothing that explained the tension radiating from the 3 officers. Derek cleared his throat and spoke in that carefully controlled voice that people use when they are trying very hard to remain calm. He asked Michael if he had packed the bag himself, if anyone else had access to it, if he knew everything that was inside, and Michael answered yes, 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 growing more frustrated with each repetition because of course he knew what was in his own damn bag. Cheryl reached into the bag with gloved hands and began removing items one by one, placing them on the table with deliberate care. A folded dress shirt, still wrapped in tissue paper from the dry cleaner. A leather toiletry kit that Michael had owned for 15 years, the corners worn soft from use. A paperback novel he had been meaning to finish for months. A phone charger, a pair of reading glasses, a small notebook with a pen clipped to the cover. Everything normal, everything mundane, everything that should have sent him on his way without a second glance. But Cheryl kept digging, her hand disappearing into the bag's interior pocket, and when she pulled out what she found there, Michael felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. It was a small metal case, about the size of a deck of cards, brushed aluminum with a clasp that had worn smooth from years of opening and closing. Michael recognized it immediately, had carried it with him for longer than he could remember, but seeing it in Cheryl's hands, seeing the way all three officers leaned forward to study it, made him realize that what was ordinary to him might look like something else entirely to people who didn't know its story. Derek asked him to open it, his voice still professional but with an undercurrent of something that might have been suspicion or might have been simple curiosity taken to an official extreme. Michael reached for the case, but Cheryl pulled it back slightly, asking him instead to describe what was inside, to tell them why he was carrying it, to explain what made it important enough to keep in his bag at all times. The questions felt like accusations even though they were delivered in neutral tones, and Michael found himself struggling to put into words something he had never really articulated to anyone. Something so personal and so painful that he had kept it locked away not just in the aluminum case but in a part of his heart he rarely examined. Before he could answer, Patricia stepped closer and pointed to something on the X-ray monitor, which she had angled so Derek and Cheryl could see. The image showed the case as a bright white shape against the darker shadows of the bag's fabric, but there was something else there too. Something inside the case that created a pattern the scanner couldn't quite interpret. A density that had triggered Patricia's initial concern. She tapped the screen with one finger and asked Michael directly what material was inside the case, whether it was metal, ceramic, organic compound, because whatever it was had properties that didn't match anything in their standard reference database. Michael felt a pressure building behind his eyes, the kind that comes before tears even though he hadn't cried in public since he was a child, since before he learned that showing emotion was weakness, and weakness was something champions couldn't afford. He looked at the three officers, at their serious faces and their tense postures, and he understood that they were just doing their jobs, trying to keep people safe, following procedures that existed for good reasons. But he also understood that some things couldn't be explained through procedures. Some things required stories and context, and a willingness to see past the surface of what appeared on a screen. He asked if they could speak somewhere private, away from the cameras and the gawking passengers, and Derek hesitated for just a moment before nodding and leading him to a small office behind the security checkpoint, a windowless room with gray walls and a desk covered in paperwork. Cheryl and Patricia followed, bringing the aluminum case with them, and when the door closed behind them, the sudden quiet felt both relieving and oppressive. Michael sat down in a plastic chair that squeaked under his weight, and Derek sat across from him while the two women remained standing, flanking him like guards, even though none of them had suggested he was under arrest or even in serious trouble. Derek set the case on the desk between them and asked again, more gently this time, what was inside and why Michael was carrying it. Michael reached for it, and this time no one stopped him. And he held it in both hands for a long moment before opening the clasp with a soft click that seemed too loud in the small room. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet that he had cut and shaped himself, was a collection of objects that would have meant nothing to anyone else but meant everything to him. A baby tooth, yellowed with age, so small it was barely visible against the dark fabric. A braid of golden hair tied with a faded pink ribbon. A small silver pendant in the shape of a star. A folded piece of paper, the creases worn thin from being opened and refolded countless times. And underneath it all, wrapped in tissue paper that crinkled softly when he touched it. Something else? Something that had triggered the scanner's confusion. Patricia leaned closer, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she recognized the case's contents for what they were. Not a threat, but a treasure. Not something dangerous, but something desperately precious. She asked Michael whose things they were, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer, already understood that only love could make someone carry such small, fragile items through airports and hotels and all the chaos of a life lived in constant motion. Michael looked up at her, and the expression on his face was so raw, so unguarded, that even Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair and looked away for a moment. The story came out slowly at first, each word feeling like it was being pulled from somewhere deep and protected. But once Michael started talking, he found he couldn't stop. Found that maybe he didn't want to stop because keeping it locked inside had become its own kind of burden. He told them about a girl named Sarah, though he had to pause and swallow hard before he could even say her name out loud. A girl who had been his daughter in every way that mattered, even though they shared no blood, no legal connection, nothing that would show up on any official document. He told them about meeting her when he was 24 years old and just starting to taste success, about walking into a children's hospital in Chicago for what was supposed to be a quick photo opportunity and finding instead a 7-year-old girl with cancer and golden hair and eyes that saw right through all his defenses. Sarah had been sick for 2 years by then, her small body ravaged by treatments that were supposed to save her, but seemed only to steal her strength and her childhood piece by piece. She had lost her hair twice already, watched it fall out in clumps that her mother cried over while Sarah herself remained stoic, somehow more composed than any child should have to be. When Michael walked into her room that day, she had looked at him with those 2 wise eyes and asked him if he was scared, not of basketball or fame or anything related to his public life, but of the thing everyone was scared of, the thing no one wanted to name. He had been so startled by the question, by its directness and its weight, that he had answered honestly without thinking, had said yes. He was scared all the time, of failure and disappointment and not being enough. Sarah had smiled at him then, a small, knowing smile, and said, "That was good." That being scared meant you cared about something, and people who didn't care about anything were already dead inside, even if their hearts were still beating. Michael had sat down on the edge of her bed, forgetting about the photographers waiting outside, forgetting about his schedule and his obligations, and they had talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, about her dreams and his dreams, and what it meant to fight for something when the odds were stacked against you. When he finally left, he had promised to come back, a promise he had made to dozens of sick kids over the years, but this time, he meant it with an intensity that surprised him. He had gone back the next week and the week after that and the week after that until visiting Sarah became part of his routine, something he protected as fiercely as his practice schedule or his game preparation. Her parents, overwhelmed and exhausted and grateful for any brightness in their daughter's life, had welcomed him without question, had let him become part of their family in that way that crisis creates. Sarah's mother, a woman named Ellen whose hands were always cold from worry, had told Michael once that he gave Sarah something to look forward to, something beyond the next treatment or the next scan or the next doctor's appointment that would tell them whether the cancer was retreating or advancing. But it wasn't just that he was giving Sarah something, Michael realized, as months turned into years, and the girl's illness became a constant thread running through his rising career. Sarah was giving him something too, something he hadn't even known he was missing. She gave him perspective when success threatened to distort his sense of reality. She gave him humility when praise threatened to inflate his ego. She gave him purpose beyond points scored and championships won. On the nights when he felt hollow despite all his accomplishments, when the noise of fame became too loud and the demands of being exceptional became too heavy, he would think of Sarah fighting battles that made his struggles look trivial, and he would find the strength to keep going. The tooth in the case, he told the 3 security officers who were now listening with complete attention, was one of Sarah's baby teeth that she had given him when she was 9 years old, making him promise to keep it safe until she was grown up and could ask for it back. The braid of hair was from before her second round of chemotherapy, cut by Ellen with shaking hands while Sarah sang softly to keep her mother from crying. The star pendant was a gift he had given Sarah for her 10th birthday, a symbol of his nickname for her, his little star who shone brightest in the darkest places. And the paper, worn thin from handling, was a letter she had written him 2 weeks before she died, when she was 11 years old and too weak to hold a pen for long, but determined to tell him everything she wanted him to know. Patricia wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, not even trying to hide the tears anymore, and Derek cleared his throat roughly and looked down at his desk, as if suddenly finding the paperwork there fascinating. Cheryl remained still. But her jaw was tight, and her eyes were bright with moisture she was fighting to contain. Michael realized he was crying too, tears running down his face unchecked, and he made no move to wipe them away because Sarah had taught him that tears weren't weakness. They were proof that your heart still worked, still felt things deeply enough to respond. He told them that Sarah had died on a Tuesday morning in March, the sky gray with late winter cold, and the hospital room filled with machines that beeped and hummed and did nothing to stop the inevitable. He had been there, holding her hand, telling her stories about places she would never get to see and games she would never get to play, while Ellen sobbed quietly on the other side of the bed, and Sarah's father stood at the window with his back to them because he couldn't bear to watch. Sarah had looked at Michael with eyes that were already seeing beyond this world and whispered that she wasn't scared, not anymore, because she had learned from him that being scared meant you cared, and she cared so much, had cared so deeply about every moment of her short life, that the fear had burned itself out and left only love behind. When she took her last breath, Michael had stayed with her for another hour, holding her hand even though it was growing cold, memorizing her face even though he knew it would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Ellen had eventually touched his shoulder and told him he could go, should go, had already given them more than any stranger was obligated to give, but Michael had looked at her and said something he had never said to anyone outside his biological family. He said that Sarah wasn't a stranger, would never be a stranger, that she was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he had failed to protect her the way a father should protect his child. Ellen had pulled him into an embrace then. This woman he had come to know through the worst experience of her life, and she had told him that he hadn't failed anyone, that he had given Sarah something irreplaceable. He had shown her that life could be extraordinary even when it was cut short, that impact wasn't measured in years but in depth of connection. He had taught her to be brave not by pretending fear didn't exist, but by choosing to care deeply despite it. And in doing so, Ellen said, he had given Sarah's too short life a kind of victory that her disease couldn't touch. After the funeral, after the crowds of well-wishers had dispersed, and the casseroles had been eaten and the sympathy cards had been filed away, Ellen had come to see Michael with a small box. Inside were the things Sarah had specifically wanted him to have, items she had chosen in those final weeks when she knew time was running out and certain decisions had to be made. The tooth she had given him years before, the braid of hair her mother had saved, the star pendant he had given her that she had worn every day until she was too weak to fasten the clasp, and the letter, which Michael hadn't been able to read for 6 months after her death because he knew that once he opened it, once he absorbed her final words, a door would close that could never be reopened. When he finally did read it, late one night after a game he had played on autopilot, the words had broken something in him that had never quite healed. Sarah had written about how much his friendship had meant to her, how it had made her feel less like a sick kid and more like a normal person who just happened to have some extra challenges to deal with. She had written about the lessons he had taught her, probably without even realizing he was teaching them, about persistence and excellence and showing up even when you didn't feel like it. But mostly, she had written about love, about how she had loved him like a father and hoped he had loved her like a daughter, and that if she had any regret about dying young, it was that she wouldn't get to see all the amazing things he was going to do with his life. Michael explained to the security officers that he had carried these items with him for 23 years, through every city and every hotel and every arena, keeping them close because letting them out of his sight felt like losing Sarah all over again. The aluminum case had been his solution, a container sturdy enough to protect the fragile objects inside while small enough to fit in whatever bag he was carrying. It had become a ritual before every game to open the case and look at the contents, to remind himself why he pushed so hard and demanded so much of himself and refused to settle for anything less than his absolute best. But there was one more thing in the case, he said. The thing wrapped in tissue paper that the scanner couldn't quite classify. And this was the part he had never told anyone, not his teammates or his family, or any of the journalists who had written thousands of words about him over the decades. Derek leaned forward as Michael carefully unwrapped the tissue paper, revealing what lay underneath with a tenderness that made it clear this was the most precious item of all. It was a small glass vial, no bigger than his thumb, sealed with a cork and wax. Inside the vial was a dark substance that looked like soil but wasn't, and even in the fluorescent light of the office, it seemed to absorb rather than reflect the illumination. Michael held it up so they could all see, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he explained what it was and why it had confused the scanner's algorithms. The vial contained ash, he said, a mixture of Sarah's cremated remains and soil from the garden where she had played as a child, before the cancer had stolen her strength and confined her to hospital beds and wheelchairs. Ellen had given it to him years after Sarah's death, during a chance meeting at a coffee shop where they had both broken down and cried over how much they missed her, how the grief never really went away but just changed shape over time, becoming less like a wound and more like a permanent scar. Ellen had told him that she and her husband had kept several vials of Sarah's ashes, unable to let go completely, unable to scatter all of her to the winds, or bury all of her in one place. She had asked Michael if he wanted one, and he had said yes without hesitation, yes because it meant Sarah could travel with him, could see all the places she had dreamed of seeing, could be present for all the moments she had predicted he would experience. The ash and soil mixture, with its combination of organic and inorganic compounds, with its density that was neither quite earth nor quite mineral, had been what triggered Patricia's concern at the X-ray machine. The scanner had flagged it as an unknown substance, something that required further investigation, and technically the officers were required to test it, to verify that it was what Michael claimed, and not something dangerous or illegal. Derek looked at the vial for a long moment, then at Michael's tear-stained face, then at Patricia and Cheryl, who were both openly crying now, and he made a decision that probably violated at least 3 regulations but felt like the only human thing to do. He handed the vial back to Michael and said they didn't need to test it, that sometimes you had to trust people, that sometimes the scanner couldn't measure what really mattered. He said that if Michael ever needed to fly through O'Hare again, he should ask for Derek personally, and they would make sure the bag got through without incident, that certain things were too sacred to be treated as potential threats. Patricia stepped forward and touched Michael's shoulder, her own mother's heart breaking for the child who had been lost, and the man who still carried her memory after all these years. Cheryl simply nodded, unable to speak, her professional composure completely shattered by a story that reminded her why she had taken this job in the first place. To protect people, yes, but also to recognize their humanity in moments of vulnerability. Michael carefully rewrapped the vial and placed it back in the case along with the tooth and the hair and the pendant and the letter, arranging them with the precise care of someone handling religious relics. He closed the case with a soft click and looked at the 3 officers who had stopped him, who had questioned him, who had ended up bearing witness to his deepest grief. He thanked them for listening, for understanding, for not dismissing what the scanner had revealed as just another procedural inconvenience. He said that sometimes he forgot that other people had their own losses, their own sacred objects they carried through the world, their own ways of holding on to what death had taken. Derek walked Michael back to the security checkpoint where his other belongings still waited on the stainless steel table, and passengers who had witnessed the initial confrontation watched with confusion as the supervisor personally helped pack the bag and handed it to Michael with a handshake that lingered longer than protocol required. No explanation was given to the onlookers. No announcement made about the resolution of whatever had caused the delay. Some mysteries were allowed to remain mysteries. Some stories weren't meant for public consumption. As Michael walked toward his gate, the aluminum case secure in his carry-on bag once more, he felt both lighter and heavier than before. Lighter because he had finally told Sarah's story to someone, had spoken aloud the grief he usually kept locked away as carefully as the objects in the case. Heavier because remembering always hurt, always would hurt. No matter how many years passed or how many championships he won or how many times people told him time would heal all wounds. Some wounds weren't meant to heal, he had learned. Some wounds were meant to stay open, tender reminders that you had loved someone deeply enough to be permanently changed by their loss. He found an empty seat near his gate and pulled out his phone, scrolling through old photos until he found one of Sarah, taken on her 10th birthday, wearing the star pendant and smiling despite the dark circles under her eyes and the thinness of her face. He looked at it for a long time, remembering her voice and her laugh and the way she had made him feel like maybe he was fighting for something that mattered beyond his own glory. Then he opened a note on his phone and typed a message he knew no one would ever read. A message to a girl who had been dead longer than she had been alive, but whose impact on him had only grown with time. The message said that he had been stopped at security today, that someone had finally asked about the case and its contents, that he had told her story for what felt like the first time, even though he had probably told it to himself 1,000 times, in the darkness of hotel rooms and the silence of early mornings. He said that he hoped she knew, wherever she was, that she had been right in her letter, that he had done amazing things with his life, but none of them had been more important than knowing her, than being loved by her, than learning from her what it meant to care so deeply that fear became irrelevant. He wrote that he still carried her with him everywhere, not just in the aluminum case, but in every decision he made and every standard he held himself to, and every moment when he chose to show up despite exhaustion or doubt, or the seductive appeal of giving less than his absolute best. He wrote that she had been his daughter in all the ways that mattered, that genetics and legal documents meant nothing compared to the bond they had forged in hospital rooms, and whispered conversations, and the sharing of fears that people weren't supposed to admit to having. And then, because he knew Sarah would have laughed at him for being so serious, he wrote that the security officers had thought his case might contain something dangerous, some threat to public safety, and in a way they had been right. Because what was more dangerous than love that refused to diminish with time, than grief that stayed sharp and present, than a commitment to remember someone so thoroughly that their absence became a kind of presence, a shape cut out of the world that nothing else could fill? The announcement came for his flight, and Michael stood and gathered his belongings and joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the gate. The aluminum case stayed in his bag, which stayed over his shoulder, which meant Sarah stayed with him as she always had and always would. He thought about the scanner that had revealed what he carried, how its impersonal algorithms and X-ray vision had seen what he usually kept hidden. And he thought about Patricia and Derek and Cheryl, who had looked past the image on their screen and seen instead a father's love for a lost daughter, a man's commitment to honoring a life that had ended far too soon. When he boarded the plane and found his seat and stowed his bag in the overhead compartment, he paused with his hand on the case through the fabric of the bag, a gesture he had performed so many times it was automatic. He felt the familiar weight of it, the solid reality of the metal and the fragile contents it protected. And he thought about Sarah's letter and her final words to him, the ones he had memorized so thoroughly that they had become part of his internal landscape, a compass he used to navigate choices and challenges and all the complexity of a life lived in public view. She had written, in handwriting that shook from weakness but remained stubbornly legible, that she hoped he would carry her memory not as a burden but as a gift. Not as something that weighed him down, but as something that lifted him up when he needed reminding of why any of this mattered. She had written that she wanted him to achieve everything he dreamed of achieving and more, to break every record and exceed every expectation, but only if doing so made him happy, made him feel fulfilled, made him feel like he was honoring not just her memory but his own potential. Most importantly, she had written that he should never forget that being scared was okay, that caring enough to be scared was actually brave, that the opposite of courage wasn't fear but indifference. She wanted him to stay scared, to stay vulnerable, to stay connected to the parts of himself that could hurt, because those were the same parts that could feel joy and love and connection. She didn't want him to armor himself against loss by refusing to let anyone matter, didn't want him to avoid grief by avoiding attachment. She wanted him to live fully, to love completely, to risk the pain of loss because the alternative was a kind of living death that she, even at 11 years old, understood was worse than actual death. The plane began to taxi, and Michael looked out the window at the airport falling away beneath them, at O'Hare growing smaller and smaller until it was just lights against darkness. He thought about Patricia seeing something unusual on her screen and making the decision to investigate rather than waving him through. And he realized that maybe it was good that someone had finally asked, good that he had been forced to articulate what he carried and why he carried it. Good that 3 strangers now knew Sarah's story and would, perhaps, remember it when they saw similar cases and similar scans in the years to come. Because the truth that the scanner had revealed, the unreal thing that had stopped him at security and led to questions and explanations and the bearing of his deepest grief, wasn't about ash or strange densities or unknown substances. The truth was about love that transcended death, about a bond between a man and a child that had formed in the crucible of terminal illness and had somehow grown stronger rather than weaker with time. About the decision to carry someone's memory, not as a weight, but as a light, a star that still shone even though the source of its illumination had gone dark years before. The plane reached cruising altitude, and Michael closed his eyes and felt the engine's steady hum beneath him, and for a moment he was back in Sarah's hospital room, holding her hand, listening to her breathe, promising her that he would remember, that he would carry her with him, that she would see the world through his eyes and experience victory through his achievements, and live on in the choices he made and the person he strove to become. And then he was back in his airplane seat, tears drying on his face, the aluminum case secure in the overhead compartment, and he whispered words that no one else could hear. But that felt like a prayer and a promise, and a renewal of vows he had taken 23 years ago without fully understanding what they would require of him. He said that he would keep going, would keep fighting, would keep carrying her with him through every airport and every challenge and every moment when it would be easier to quit than to persist. He said that he understood now what the scanner had revealed, that it wasn't the contents of his case that were unreal, but the depth of his love for a girl who had never been his daughter legally, but had been his daughter completely. The kind of love that couldn't be measured or classified or explained through normal channels because it existed outside the boundaries of conventional relationships and ordinary grief. The businessman sitting next to him glanced over, probably wondering about the tears, probably debating whether to offer a tissue or pretend not to notice, and Michael gave him a small smile and looked back out the window. There was no way to explain. No way to make this stranger understand what the scanner had seen, or why it mattered, or how a routine security check had become a moment of revelation and release. Some things could only be understood through experience, through your own losses and your own sacred objects, and your own decisions about what to carry and what to leave behind. And so Michael Jordan flew on through the night sky, the aluminum case in the compartment above his head containing a baby tooth and a braid of golden hair and a star pendant, and a letter and a vial of ash mixed with soil, physical remnants of a girl named Sarah, who had taught him that being scared meant you cared, and caring was the whole point of being alive. The scanner had revealed something unreal, yes, but not unreal in the sense of false or imagined or fabricated. Unreal in the sense of extraordinary, transcendent, beyond the normal parameters of human connection and loss, and love that refused to diminish despite death and time and distance. Unreal in the way that all deep love is unreal, defying logic and measurement, and the small-minded assumption that people stop mattering once they stop breathing, that daughters stop being daughters once they leave this world, that carrying someone's ashes through airport security is anything other than the most natural, most necessary, most profoundly human act imaginable. Michael's story reminds us that everyone we meet is carrying something precious, something that shaped who they are. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so drop your city or country in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so we can keep spreading kindness and sharing stories that matter. There's another incredible story waiting for you on the screen right now, so click it and let's keep this journey going together.